Brilliant. Amazing. So like Emma said, thanks for everybody that signed up and welcome to the last of the Introduction to Ecology online talks. I feel like Emma always makes a big fuss because Emma always talks about how great it is to have me here. But Emma's done all of the background work to get these talks up and running and to send everybody out all of the meeting information and the summary emails and generally make my life a lot easier. So thank you so much for helping us, Emma. And hopefully we'll see more of the Wildlife Champions program and you in 2025. So yeah, like I said at the beginning, it's so nice to see some familiar faces that have attended the sessions before. I've tried to do the sessions relatively logically, but hopefully the general vibe that people have been getting is that ecology is a very vast subject, and it's been hard to balance what's enough information versus what's interesting, and you can just go down rabbit holes. So congratulations if you've made it this far. We are ending this week on biological monitoring, as it's a really important part of any wildlife projects, any actions we take for nature, particularly on those sort of larger community level and regional level scales. So firstly, we'll begin where any self-respecting presentation starts and define exactly what we mean by the phrase biological monitoring. Biological recording or biological monitoring is the scientific study of the location and spread of living things. That's plants, animals, fungi, it can be bacteria, it can be humans. Anyone and everyone can make a biological record, from beginners to experts, and you can even make a biological record if you don't really know exactly what you found. Generally, a good photograph to accompany a submission can provide enough information for others to help you identify a species. Making records of the wildlife that you see is a really valuable way to contribute to our collective understanding of the natural world as well. That includes changes in species distributions, maybe declines in populations or new species occurring in new areas. This might be for your personal interest or to feed into a national monitoring scheme. And it's really important to record even the common species you see regularly, as they're often ignored or under-recorded. This may mean that population declines may not be noticeable until numbers have reduced dramatically, making such declines a lot harder to reverse. So the reason I've got a sort of skinny, sad looking pigeon there on the screen is because a great example of this is the passenger pigeon, a American species once so numerous that tree branches were said to break under the weight of their collective roosts that were known as cities, and are now completely extinct. For a variety of reasons. So just because it's not rare or something that you see every day doesn't mean that it's not an important thing to record. So why do we do it? Biological recording happens on many scales, from sort of big multi-year studies like the famous Bristolian Children of the 90s study, which looked at the lives of massive groups of kids born in the 90s. That's biological recording. Or perhaps the annual pond dipping events at Willsbridge Mill that used to be conducted by Avon Wildlife Trust. I used to attend those as a kid. That's a form of biological monitoring too. I hope that they used to record their findings. Monitoring the species and habitats that of our environment tells us what's there, maybe how many there are, and over time we can compare these results to see if this has stayed the same or changed. And as I'll talk about shortly, biological records are collated by local environmental record centres, which are then used by local councils to inform local plans, or to inform the planning permissions of different developments. It also helps authorities responding to sort of emerging diseases or trends in the environment. So there's many different types of monitoring scheme, as we'll go over shortly, and many different things you can survey at different times. But the fundamentals of what makes a good biological record is always the same. It's the 4 W's. You always want to record who saw the thing. Was it you? Was it your child? Were you part of a big group? Are you submitting everything that you've seen, or are you submitting on behalf of other people? This can seem a little bit of an administrative request, but if the people verifying the record need to double check something, maybe you've actually uncovered something quite rare or unusual or unexpected, they may need to be able to contact you. So this can be as little as, ensuring that you're submitting records from the email address you use, or including a contact number on sheets that you send in. Next is what. So what was it that you actually saw, heard, or found? In the what section, you want to include as much demographic information as possible. Was the thing alive or dead? Was it an adult or a juvenile, maybe an egg or a larvae? Could you tell if it was a female or male? Do you know what the defining characteristic of that species is? Write all of that down. That's really important information to sort of evidence what you found. When did you see this? You need to include the dates, perhaps the time of day if it feels relevant for the species. Sometimes really similar species can be differentiated by the times that they occur. And lastly, the most important part of the record, arguably, is the location of your spot. Now, this really does need to be as exact as possible. You can just use a postcode or a nearest postcode. That's really handy. But really, the best location information is either a grid reference or using what 3 words. And we've got some info on using these later in the presentation too. So how do we record? You can do biological recording on any space at any time, but the results you get are going to massively vary on your method and the way that you plan your surveying. You could monitor the moths that visit your porch light, or you could monitor the birds on your walk to work one day a month, or you could use a point and shoot app each time you find something interesting. More traditional methods might involve using ID sheets or books and capturing what you found temporarily in pots or trays. This is good if you want to be really exact in your reporting, or you want to do a really detailed and thorough examination of a space. It's also a good way to challenge your ID skills. But more accessible methods that require much less equipment and technical knowledge involve often just phone apps that will use AI to tell you what you think it thinks that you're looking at. It is worth considering that often the error rate is a bit higher with apps, and you do have to have a certain level of understanding roughly what you're looking at. But it is a faster and really useful way of still exercising your critical thinking skills and getting familiar with a site. And another good thing about apps is they have other people on them who will verify findings. So you're not submitting masses of false information to sort of national records, because they will be filtered through a verification process. But yeah, if you're submitting more traditionally collected records, it's always good to include photos with your submission to be checked at a later date. So we know what we can record. We know we can record anything, and we know we can record anywhere within reason. But how do we give ourselves the highest chances of success? Well, we want to be doing our monitoring in times when we know the target species are active or at least visible. We wouldn't get a very good idea of the wildflower diversity of a meadow if we surveyed it in January, and we wouldn't get a very accurate reading on the number of frogs using a pond if we looked in December. So as a general rule of thumb, spring to autumn are the best seasons to survey, with winter being a bit of an exception because it's a fantastic time to go bird watching. But if you can't choose what to look for, or you don't know the active periods for the things that you want to survey, you can look up a survey calendar online to inform what to look for and when. I've included this fantastic survey calendar by the Natural History Museum because it shows all of the different national schemes for biological recording surveys that you don't need technical licenses or additional materials to be able to do. So I've included a link to this at the end of the presentation, and it's a really wonderful resource whether you use it for activities, maybe with young people in the summer, or as a prompt next time you've got a free day and you fancy going for a nice walk. Or perhaps, you might have built a new pond or planted a new hedge and you want to keep an eye on how the wildlife is responding to that. So I mentioned local environmental record centres earlier as the standard place that most apps like iNaturalist or iRecord send their records to. In the former county of Avon, our regional centre that covers all of our devolved counties is the Bristol Regional Environmental Record Centre, also known as BREC. So that covers South Gloss, Baines, Bristol City and North Somerset. Every county has a local environmental record centre, also abbreviated as a LERC, as And as part of that job, they collate the records that have been sent into them across the entire region, and they'll have teams of verifiers to confirm or reject records. They also discharge lists of existing records to ecologists for different reasons in different organisations, but they do charge a fee for this service to help keep the record centre open, which is affordable for businesses, but can be challenging for community groups to afford. So as a result of that, there are free options that we'll go into later. But the benefit of using BREC is to investigate local records is that you'll receive the most up-to-date information available, and you can ask for a really bespoke package of data if you're only interested in certain things. I know some of the people on this call are specifically interested in bats and what bats are in the area. You can ask BREC for bat-only data for a very specific area around the site that you're investigating. Alternatively, you might be organising, a big mega balsam bash in your postcode, and you might want to know all of the records of balsam. So you could ask for a specific invasive non-native species data search. It may seem overkill, but if you're really, really keen on doing a sort of deep dive into the wildlife in your area, then you can look at historical records. As a free alternative to BREC, NBN Atlas is a free national service that collates older species records from the national network of LERCs, the record centres. So it's a more accessible way of having a look at what sort of species records are in your area. The downside of that is that there's a bit of a lag of a few years. So if you want really, really up-to-date records, NBN isn't going to be able to give you that. But that shouldn't matter too much if you're just having a bit of a cursory look to see roughly what exists in the area. And just because there isn't a record, it's really important to remember that that doesn't mean that something doesn't exist. There's different levels of survey effort for different areas and different places, and vice versa. Sometimes there's so much attention on certain species, it can look like maybe there's hundreds of animals when actually maybe it's just the same 4 very famous hedgehogs going house to house and getting recorded. So don't rely on them as gospel, but do use them to inform your areas of interest. And for anybody that's interested in how to navigate NBN Atlas, we can include a video of how to navigate that portal in the summary email tomorrow. Oh. Okay, so we've covered the different reasons you might want to do some biological recording and why it's important and where those records end up and how you can use them on a local scale. But what are the existing ways you can contribute to biological recording without needing to have a spreadsheet, a hand lens, a library of identification keys, or a reasonable background in taxonomy? Well, that's what the second half of this presentation is all about. And indeed, many nature charities exploit the vast general knowledge and interests of the public to collect useful data to help inform their strategies or flag new population trends or just collect new data sets to be able to use in the future. Charities may do this with structured events they run, or by designing and rolling out helpful apps to make things really accessible, or just by relying on people's interest in a subject. It may involve one-off events or coordinating regular specific surveys, and we'll go over sort of what I feel are the sort of, I don't know how many I've got on here, but maybe the top 10 or 12 different biological recording schemes that exist in Avon. I've tried to keep it nice and varied with options for city dwellers as well as country folk. There's a couple in there for people that are on the coast and also pond dippers, old and young. And there's a general theme that will start with the ones that I think are the most foolproof and accessible, leading to those that require a bit more training, commitment, or additional interest. So it's been 15 minutes and I've been talking at you guys pretty consistently. We're just going to take a quick 2-minute break. We'll be back at 22 minutes past 6 and we'll dive into those different schemes.
Awesome. Sounds good. And feel free to pop any questions in the chat as we're going along.
I always like having a look through the comments when we have our breaks. And yeah, good point, Peter. I should have added on there to add the weather information. That's a very helpful addition. Absolutely.
And someone's flagged Merlin as well as a good app. It's probably my favourite bird sound recording app because it tells you all the different birds that are calling at the same time. So if you have 7 things calling, it will light up depending on which species is calling at the time. So it's really good to learn. But also, if you're overwhelmed by a dawn chorus, that is also quite a nice way to see what's around.
Is that how you found your gold crest last week at Grow Wilder, Emma?
No, that was just me running off into the bush with my cameras because it didn't quite look like another bird. So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, that was a great addition to the records up at Grow Wilder. Yeah, Sue, I've added that into my presentation because of the fact you raised it on our weekend session just gone. So yeah, thanks for raising again in the chat. That's a really good point. If you are regularly contributing data to Breck, it's a good idea to create an account rather than just sending records as a guest so that you can keep track of all of the records that you've sent in. Okay, nice. We've had our 2 minutes. I will crack on.
Do you want to give like 1 more minute in case anyone's going to the loo or anything, Amy?
Yeah. Cool. Shall I crack on then?
Yeah, go ahead. It's recorded anyway, so people can always catch up.
Fab. So, existing national schemes. I'm going to start with a few that are self-led. So, firstly, we have iNaturalist, which many of you on the call may have already heard of. This is a free app-based survey method, so there's no need for special considerations or planning. You just download it, make an account, and then start taking photos of things. In Bristol, we often use the iNaturalist app for the City Nature Challenge or for running bioblitzes, which we will cover later on. And essentially, the app has an AI algorithm that tells you roughly what it thinks it's looking at based on the photo that you've taken. It's also going to be able to recognize animals and plants, but it can struggle with fungi. iNaturalist does send its records to local record centres, but the records can be really hard to use if you have the privacy settings on that obscure record locations. And there's information on the Breck website and AWT website that will include with our summary email on how to toggle those settings so that your records are as usable as possible. You can see on the screenshot on the right of this slide, which is from the Explore function as well. This is a really great function of this app where you can have a look at what other people have locally recorded. And at our Introduction to Ecology Biodiversity Action Plan in-person workshop this weekend, one of our colleagues, Alex, shared a really lovely story about how she managed to find out about glowworms in Lawrence Weston and lead a sort of total change of the management plan of Lawrence Weston Moor based on that finding. And that was a species that hadn't come up on sort of those more formal recording services like NBN or Breck previously in that area for a really long time. So yeah, using the Explore function on iNaturalist is a great way to have a little look around and see what else other people are looking at. Yeah, so that's a really nice one. Very similar to iNaturalist, but specific to plants and trees, we have PlantNet. So I really like this one for botany as it's a bit more accurate and it will tell you how confident it is on the recommendation it makes. So you tell it if it's looking at fruit or flowers or leaves or even bark, and it will flag whether it thinks that plant is non-native to Northern Europe as well. So if you're looking in a garden, it might constantly flag that they're world flora species, but really handy if you're in a more naturalistic space and you don't know what something is, but it's flagging it as non-native. You can see on the right here, the screenshot is a screenshot that I took from a couple of days ago where it's identified a little sprout in my allotment that it says is a water figwort and it's 89% sure. So I'm really confident to go along with it and say, yeah, that's water figwort. But yeah, there's also photographs of the suggested species. So you can click on other confirmed records and compare the picture that you've taken with these other photos of the suggested species and see whether or not they match. Yeah, it's important to remember that these apps are not 100% accurate all the time. So if something seems odd, it's always good to double check your findings. But often the app will help narrow down to a plant in a family or a genus, and then you can use the ID guide to get an accurate reading if you're doing like a more formal survey. So here's one I didn't know that actually existed until I made this webinar, and I'm absolutely going to use it when I'm next at the beach. The Shark Trust have got their own point and shoot ID app, specifically made for mermaids' purses or skate and ray egg cases. So I don't know if you can see the picture there. You might recognize it from other walks you've had on the beach, but each species of skate and some sharks, like dogfish, have completely different, unique egg case shapes to their species. And by taking a photo, the app is able to recognize the species that it belongs to. And this is really helpful for helping to track the species present and the diversity. The sharks will lay these not all year round. Typically they don't tend to lay their eggs over winter, but because of how long it takes them to get dislodged from seaweed and get blown up to shore, you can really find them all year round. And by recording your findings, you're helping the Shark Trust discover more about egg laying species in our water. So that's quite a cool one as well. This one might be one of the most famous citizen science events, the RSPB's Big Garden Bird Watch, which has just passed. For 1 hour each year on the last weekend of Jan, the RSPB asks people to spend 1 hour over the weekend counting all the garden birds that enter their space. And this information, when scaled up to the national level, contributes an additional 8 to 10 million bird records every year to national schemes. This vast database allows the RSPB to look at general trends over time and look at the abundance and spread of garden birds. And it's also a really accessible way of getting new people out and about and a bit more in tune with the bird life in their local area. So for such a small commitment, this is a really great example of strength in numbers. And I've included here because I forgot to submit my results, but you can submit your results anytime up until the 23rd of February. So if you have done a garden bird watch, make sure you get those uploaded. Next up, we've got the Fit Count, which is part of the UK pollinator monitoring scheme. So the name of the app isn't super useful to find the app in the App Store logically, but it has a purpose. It stands for the Flower Insect Timed Count. Very catchy, us ecologists, as that's exactly what you do with this app. You let the app know where you are, what kind of flowers you've chosen to watch, and then it gives you a grid of the main sort of 8, I think it may be 10 or 12 different main groups of pollinators. You then stand for 10 minutes watching your 1 meter square area of flowers, and every time a new pollinator enters that square and lands on a flower, you click what type of pollinator it was. So it'll have, flying beetles, it'll have bumblebees, it'll have hoverflies, it'll have honeybees. So you can click on what you see and it keeps a tally. The app's also got some simple guides on how to tell a hoverfly from a wasp or a bumblebee from a honeybee. So it's pretty informative as well if you're not extremely familiar with pollinators. For this one, you do want the weather to be good, as it's and you need a nice, dry, sunny day to be ideal. And just remember that the insects do have to actually land on the flowers and not just pass by. This is another one run by the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, which is just a good term to search in your sort of Play Store or App Store, because they generate a lot of these sort of cutting edge conservation apps. So a good thing to have a browse on. Of course, I've included something about ponds. The big pond dip. Pond dipping is a really familiar childhood pastime for many of us, and ponds have been declining in our wider landscape, as I'm sure we're all aware of, and our waterways have been declining in quality massively. So the essential water for wildlife to survive is becoming more and more limited. So creating a wildlife pond is the number one action you can do to support wildlife, particularly in urban areas. But how do you know if your pond is good or not? is it developed in the healthy invertebrate structure that you're aiming for, or is it a bit of a dead zone? The appearance of ponds can be really deceptive on how much wildlife it supports, and counting the number of insect species in your pond is a really widely used method in water habitat assessments, which we'll touch on later. So for the big pond dip, you just fill in the form based on how many different insect groups you can spot, and you add up the number to get a total score of the number of species present. And then this will give you some advice on what you can do to improve your pond if it's not getting the maximum score. So that's a really nice activity you can do anytime, sort of from spring to autumn. It's particularly fun if you're doing it with young people and you've come across some dragonfly larvae. Next up, we have the 2 hedgerow surveys being run by the People's Trust for Endangered Species. This one is also new to me, and I think maybe it's in an earlier stage of development because it's not quite as intuitive as the other apps. But essentially, there's 2 different ones. The Healthy Hedgerows app, which is on the mobile app, and then the Great British Hedgerow Survey, which is a more in-depth one that's computer-based. They're probably going to merge them, but at the moment they are separate. Healthy Hedgerows is an app that's primarily designed for farmers, but also for anybody who manages hedges or owns land with hedgerows on and is interested in their health. You download the app and set up an account, and you measure the hedge and select different shape features that most closely resemble the hedge that you're surveying. And you'll put in how many trees there are and how many gaps there are and how many woody species you can count that are different. And based on that data, it will give you some bespoke management advice based on the hedge that you've entered. So note that this is for native hedges. It won't work on your sort of ornamental Leylandii hedge, which kind of suck for wildlife anyway. But the Great British Hedgerow Survey is an online hedge assessment, which is just a bit more in depth. It still allows you to select your hedge based on the shape, which you'll see on the next page, which is a really great way of becoming familiar with the features of a healthy hedge, which is also, like, I really love hedgerows. It's something I enjoy a lot when you go into the countryside, taking note of hedges, especially if you're into foraging and things like that. Hedgerows are absolutely abundant with wonderful things to get nibbling on. But make sure you know what you're eating. You didn't get that from me. The UK has lost about 50% of its hedgerows since World War II. So it's really important that we ensure those remaining hedgerows are in really good condition. So on this slide, I've just included a screenshot of the website for the Great British Hedgerow Survey. So this has got the the Adams Hedgerow Management Scale, which I really like as like a pictorial way of assessing something rather than having loads of wordy technical words, loads of technical jargon and like wordy descriptions. So yeah, I thought I'd include that. So next up, we have some pre-organized local efforts that you can get involved with if you want to step your game up from occasional recording to more structured surveys with time commitments. So firstly, we've got river detectives from the Bristol Avon Rivers Trust. River detectives are people who volunteer to help BART monitor water quality using dipsticks on their local waterways in their area. So they provide initial training on why the work's important and how to use the dipsticks and the corresponding charts that you read them off. And then they will post you a new set of dipsticks each month for you to go and repeat the survey. So the data from these surveys are then uploaded onto the River Hubs platform, which is what this screenshot is here. And you can navigate results from across the country over time, lengths, and with different pollutant levels. So it's really informative. And beyond this, as something that's quite interesting to have a nosy on, BART used the data to look at repeat offender sites and launch further investigations to find out why there's high sewage or pollution outputs. And they can also then go out later on with much more expensive technical equipment to investigate the wider water parameters and build a bit of a case to understand exactly what's going on in that waterway. So to get involved with that, you can go to the BART website and sign up. Another great citizen science project being run by BART is the Riverfly Monitoring Programme, which is on behalf of the Riverfly Partnership. So this is a more technical form of biological monitoring, as it involves taking monthly kick samples from a nominated section of river and identifying the invertebrates that you find. So it's a bit like doing a bit more of a challenging pond dip in many ways. There's a number of different indicator species that you're looking for. So you're not starting from total scratch, but this is one that you'll need a good eye for identification for. And you do get initial training, which I believe is really sort of oversubscribed. So that's really nice to see how many people in Bristol are looking to take action for our waterways. The results from these surveys are then often reported to the Environment Agency alongside other river fly monitoring organisations across the country, sort of feed into that real national understanding of the diversity of our different water catchments. So a really cool project being run by BART. Penultimately, I've included the Bristol section of the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, or the NPMS, you might have heard of. The Bristol scheme is based on the standardised methodology for the National Plant Monitoring Scheme, but it gives the managing authority, Bristol City Council, the flexibility to monitor multiple sites across Bristol, essentially. So the methodology focuses on plant recording in specific habitat types in pre-selected squares that are then surveyed once in spring and again in summer according to the predetermined survey techniques that is part of the national scheme. So there's extensive materials that explain the different methods you can use, and there's a couple of different types of survey that you can perform. And this is a really good one to do as a group. That ensures that you're being as thorough as you can. And also when you're first getting to grips with the process, it's quite a lot to take on. So it's good to have a group of people that can, keep up the momentum of the repeat visits. For this one, you'll probably want to have a wildflower key to hand and perhaps a hand lens to help you understand plants. And probably as well a way of marking out your survey area is really handy. When I've been to the historical plant monitoring schemes in Lawrence Weston, we've used blue rope and wooden poles to mark out the areas we're surveying, because in grasslands it's 5 meters by 5 meters, but in woodlands it's 10 meters by 10 meters. So to make sure you're really getting everything within that area, it is good to mark out. And I've included a link to some more information on the Lockleys Neighbourhood Trust website on how to get involved on here, but also the reference list at the end too. It says plant portal there, by the way, because that's where you submit your findings. I've just realized I haven't explained that. Plant portal is just the national repository for all of the data that's collected as part of the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. So last but by no means least, we have the UK Butterfly Monitoring Scheme, or the UK BMS. That it is one of the longest running insect monitoring schemes in the world. The scheme began in 1976 and now records data on around 3,000 sites nationally every year. And the transects, which are walked routes that are repeated, are walked weekly during a 26-week period between the 1st of April and the 29th of September every year. So this allows the measurement of the changes in butterfly populations for the 50 species that are native here, especially when those transects are repeated year on year, to build up a longitudinal understanding of the populations in that area. To do the survey, you first select your route and agree it with a local coordinator. You'll complete a site assessment form, and then you'll use recording forms that are provided by UKBMS to submit your findings at the end of the survey period. They do also accept single species surveys and other survey methods that involve less time commitment if the 26 standard visits are too much to attend. But as with all the schemes we've talked about today, you can find out a wealth of information on the websites for each of these too. So those are some of the main national and local schemes for biological monitoring available in Avon, and hopefully you might have heard either ones that you've already heard about or something new that interests you today, whether that's downloading a new app or maybe somewhere to take your passion for pollinators. But I wanted to know, just before we wrap up, another great activity that's not part of a national scheme per se, and can be done at any time with any group of people, with any method that you prefer, and it's BioBlitz. BioBlitz is an activity that's promoted by the National Biodiversity Network, and they involve recording everything you can in a set area of your choice and then submitting all of those records afterwards. So this could be using apps, this could be using wildflower keys, maybe acoustic equipment or moth traps, whatever your group wants to record. They do it together over, say, an hour or a 5 hour or 1 day period. This is a really great activity for getting people to look a bit closer into their environment, to work together to identify living things, and to feel a bit more connected to the environment around them. It's also really good for establishing baselines of sites if you don't have much information and you want to know what you're dealing with at the very beginning of a project or when you start making actions for nature, and then you have something to compare the impacts of the actions you've taken. I've also included a couple of screenshots of the guides available to help people that want to run a BioBlitz. I know there's a few community leaders on this call tonight, so yeah, we'll include a couple of links to those guides too. So I mentioned BREC at the beginning of the call. All of the schemes we've just talked about have self-submitting record systems. So you don't need to submit your records to the local record centre if you're already using those apps. However, if you're submitting one-off sightings or BioBlitz results, maybe you've seen a sparrowhawk on your neighbour's roof or a couple of glowworms on your evening walk to the shops, you can submit these directly to the BREC website. These were videos, but they weren't working when I tried to play them earlier. Oh, is it working actually? I think it might be.
The grass moves slightly, but it.
So it's
oh yeah,
not.
no, it is. It is.
Okay,
It's
great.
moving.
So we'll send out these slides so people can watch them when they if they want to use the BREC self-submission page. But yeah, so it's quite intuitive, but the BREC website does change its layout based on which tab you go on, which is a bit confusing, but yeah, I think it's a bit of a work in progress. So further resources, I've included a list here to namely the Natural History Museum, Biological Recording Resources Hub, a bit of a mouthful, which I've got a screenshot of on the right. So that's what this screenshot is. It's a really fantastic resources page on the internet that is an absolute wealth of different survey ideas, different activity ideas. Really great if you're working with groups of people that don't have a massive amount of existing biological knowledge, or just you want to stir up that initial passion and interest in local wildlife. So I'd really recommend checking out the Biological Recording Resources Hub there. I've included links to two of the standard best practice guides of wildflower identification books. That's Rose's Wildflower Key and Colin's Wildflower Guide. Field Studies Council identification sheets are laminated. They're a couple of quid each and they're fantastic for just really quick glance IDs. I've got a couple of ID sheets in the back of my car. At Avon Wildlife Trust, we use these all the time for our public sessions. As I mentioned earlier, the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology, CEH, they produce a lot of different national monitoring apps. So you can just search that on your app store and see what takes your interest. If you're interested in getting involved in either of the BART aquatic monitoring schemes, then you can go on their website and get in touch. There's the link to the Bristol plant monitoring scheme, and then also a prompt there for Grid Reference Finder, which is a website which converts different geographic information. It's very handy, and also a reminder to download the What 3 Words app. Just use it all the time. Very handy app. And then our survey calendar. So yeah, that's everything this week. Thank you guys for sitting through that. Anybody that's been to a couple has gone on the journey of my cold with me, and you can probably hear I can breathe this week. So yeah, thanks for attending. I hope you've really enjoyed the session, and I'll pass back over to Emma.
Brilliant, Amy. Thanks so much. That was excellent as always. Just wanted to do a final little plug before we go into questions for camera trapping as well. So that's something that I'm super, super passionate about in terms of another way to monitor what is happening locally. And there's also a website called Mammal Web, I think, which is a citizen science camera trapping platform where you can go through footage, even of the Scottish Wildcats project in the Cairngorms, and you can go through their footage and help them ID and see whether they've got wild Scottish wildcats, just as an example of something cool that you can tap into.
Yeah,
Um,
brilliant.
but yeah, there's some really good questions, Amy. Birgit was asking, what is the difference between BREC and MBN? Does BREC pass on their data to MBN? I thought it might be good to clarify that.
Yeah, so NBN is a national repository of records, and they collate data from all of the different local environmental record centres, whereas BREC is a regional specific data centre, and they are collating all of the most recent data. So NBN is great, but it takes 1, 2, possibly 3 years for records to make their way through BREC and get sent off to the NBN Atlas. So the difference really is just down to, I think, accuracy. And I think, no, I was going to say maybe BREC only sends their notable species records to NBN Atlas, but I don't think that's true. But yeah, essentially, BREC is the site for on the pulse, most up to date, most accurate data, and NBN is for those older records, which is the reason as well there's the cost difference essentially.
Yeah. And then also on a similar tangent with BREC from Kai, you kind of answered this about whether you need to submit to other apps or sites if you're using specific apps. Like, is it always good to submit to iNaturalist or BREC, or does that depend what apps you're using?
Yeah, so if you're already using the apps, I would say don't secondarily submit. It'll save you a lot of time, but generally you have to confirm your citing on most of the apps, especially if they're the apps that use AI to suggest what you've seen. So, if you're using a point and shoot app, just to find out roughly what you're looking at, I just generally don't confirm the record if I'm not sure. I don't believe that what I've scanned is actually species accurate. But yeah, I generally would say for like one-off sightings, or if you're doing more technical surveys that might be focused on individual species groups or a habitat, and you're going into detail, then get that straight to BREC. Whereas when you're just doing it more casually for interest, then the apps are absolutely fine. And like I said, they've got their in-house verifiers that will throw away anything that's misidentified.
Awesome. Yeah. And then we've got another question from Birgit saying that she'd like to set up a regular / long-term wildlife and pollinator plant monitoring at the allotment with the tenants. So do you have any apps or schemes that you would recommend for that kind of long-term monitoring?
Yeah, I feel like because allotments are such diverse places and you're dealing with a group of people with diverse commitments to regular monitoring, if you've got anybody in-house that has got specific interests or specific talents for recognizing certain species, you might have the local BS3 spider guy that has an allotment there. Absolutely exploit that talent. He's probably going to be the authority on that species group, and so if he would like to collect, I'm saying he as if women aren't also into obscure spider species, but yeah, make the most of those talents that you have in your group. But otherwise, I think a really nice thing that you could do is having like an annual bioblitz, maybe choosing a day in the middle of the year when you get a group of people together and maybe they all download iNaturalist, or people bring whatever survey equipment they feel comfortable using, maybe a butterfly net or a wildflower guide, and then everybody just collects information on everything that they found all at one time. That's a really good way. Or sometimes I've also heard of groups of more sort of spread out groups will have a WhatsApp group that they'll just submit interesting sightings they've had and say, oh, this morning at 6 p.m. I saw, well, at 6 a.m. I saw a weasel in this area. And then somebody will go through that WhatsApp group and collect all of that data and submit it off. So there's a few different approaches you could take. But I think, yeah, keeping it nice and open and generalist would be a good way to start.
And also, there's some other advice Sue's just shared that BREC have a printable sheet that you can ask people to fill in. She's holding one up very conveniently. Thank you, Sue. So that could be a nice thing to do with the community as well. You just have that in your bag or in a shed or something.
Totally. Just
Keep
put it in like a
recording it.
laminated wallet. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can kind of submit like en masse, which is quite, I imagine, is quite rewarding, and you have all these records from the community that you can then submit.
Totally, totally. That's something that I notice all the time being out speaking to community groups, going all over Avon, is that you go to places and people say, "Oh, we've got a family of badgers that live over here," or "Oh, there's a pair of kestrels that nest over on this corner of the common and they've been there for years." And you think, but nobody else knows about that because it's not recorded in a formal sense. Or when I go to sites, I'll do a background data check to see roughly what the area's known for species wise. And yeah, and I'm always meeting people that are telling me about incredible local species that there's no formal paper trail of. And it's only by creating that paper trail that we're able to create a mandate for protecting those areas and protecting those species. It can, like we said, inform planning decisions. It can make sure that additional mitigations are being put in place to protect wildlife. So it's really, really important. Yeah, I can see Charlie's put something about Belmont about all of the species surveys, which is great. Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, nice to
Um,
see lots of sharing in the chat as well, because between you all, there's so much knowledge and experience. So it's really great to share that.
yeah,
There was
absolutely.
another question from Carol asking if the Bristol plant monitoring scheme is just for Bristol, or does that extend anywhere else?
I believe it's actually Avon, but for sort of accuracy. Oh, or no, actually, maybe it is because it's Bristol City Council that operate it. I will look into that for you and we'll pop that in the summary email at the end. Yeah, because I'm not entirely sure on that. Since they split up the Avon County, some things include certain devolved counties and some things don't. So we'll make sure we find that out.
And some Lizzie was asking if there's a similar sort of monitoring scheme for moths. I shared the National Moth Recording Scheme, which is part of the Butterfly Conservation Trust. Would you say that's kind of the go-to monitoring scheme for moths?
I would say that if it's part of the BMS sort of group of surveys, it's going to be great. But I do not survey moths. But we do have somebody on the call today that surveys moths. So, Charlie, if you know anything about preferred schemes for reporting moths, please pop that in the chat because yeah, that'd be good to link Lizzie up with where you would recommend.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm just scrolling through and seeing what other ones we have. We had a question about a iRecord app. That wasn't one we put
Oh
on
yeah,
there. What do we think of that one?
yeah, so I only use the apps that I personally downloaded first and got on with, but iRecord is another great app. I think was iRecord set up by a wildlife trust, I think. And yeah, it operates very similarly to iNaturalist. I believe they don't quite have the same issues of the data being collected being difficult to get exact locations because iRecord is made in the UK, whereas iNaturalist is an American app. So the obscuring of records in America means that you can protect wildlife from being exploited. But in the UK, because of the scale of the countries, when you obscure something to a 5 kilometre radius, that could be no longer in Bristol and it's actually over in Bath. So it doesn't quite work as well. But yeah, we'll share that information on how to make sure that they're accurately recorded. But yeah, iRecord, I've heard loads of good things. I think a lot of people use iRecord for amphibians and reptile surveys. So yeah, just trying out different apps and seeing what you get on best with. They're all going to have different user interfaces. They're all going to have different sort of intuitive uses. So giving them a go.
And I think Peter also mentioned another one in the chat, which I use called Seek,
Mm.
which is kind of a branch of iNaturalist. And I find that helpful for just out and about ID. You don't even have to take a picture if you don't want to. You can hover over something, and that will give you pretty accurate ID of most species. Sometimes the app has a little bit of a paddy and it's not hugely reliable, but when it does work, it's really good.
Nice.
And then I've got two kind of linked questions. So we've got one from Peter where other people have already answered, which is great. Of do you know of any particular kind of larger area groups that undertake things like bioblitzes or group monitoring activities at that larger scale?
Off the top of my head, I mean, if our project wasn't wrapping up, I'd say that we'd do some this year, but we can't make those promises because we don't know what's happening fingers crossed we'll get some more funding. Yeah, I think the best thing to do is, I think I saw somebody make a comment about Eventbrite, following different organizations across the county, and seeing what events they put out there. Sometimes the museums will organise them, sometimes ENGOs will organise them, sometimes it's just community groups. I'd say just making sure that you're involved in different wildlife groups, whether you have Facebook, signing up to wildlife groups, signing up to different e-newsletters that exist around Bristol, and signing up as well to the Biological Recording Company. I'll give them a plug. They are an independent charitable organization, I believe, of naturalists and various different speciality researchers, and they put on loads and loads and loads of different webinars, from free series about hedgehogs and research on how to make your garden more hedgehog friendly, to like, what was the one that they were promoting the other day? A lot of them they charge a tenner for example, which was like Worms of the UK Part 3. Yeah, there's enough information for there to be 3 parts on Worms of the UK. You heard it here first. So loads of really cool talks, depending on what your interest is. I think they also do a lot of symposiums. So we attended the wildlife gardening symposium that they ran, which was like a £25 ticket. So yeah, the Biological Recording Company on Eventbrite is a really fantastic one to follow as well.
Yeah, and kind of follow on from that, Paul was asking what Eventbrites, you could sign up to find practical events like this. I think there's so many good places. I think what Bristol and the Avon region is really missing is a platform where all of this comes together. Part of my
Yeah.
role every month involves trawling all the possible areas where events could be published and trying to collate that into some kind of calendar, which I share with the Wildlife Champions. But I really do feel like that needs to be in one place. But I'm
Mm,
happy to share in the follow-up email all the places I look as a go-to for free or low-cost nature-themed events. That some of them are really, really awesome. They kind of seem to be a bit hidden and under the radar, but
for
I'll
sure.
share that.
Absolutely. That's brilliant.
Um,
And I noticed somebody also mentioned, Lizzie mentioned about the Festival of Nature. Absolutely. Keeping your eyes peeled for Festival of Nature activities, keeping your eyes peeled on the Bristol Natural History Consortium. Yeah, the Festival of Nature at the moment is in its planning stages, but I would be very surprised if there isn't information on doing some sort of BioBlitz events this year.
Yeah, and there's also some really helpful advice that Sue shared about submitting records to BREC. So Sue said that you can get the 8-digit grid reference required by BREC using what 3 words. So she's put on there how you can do that. So if you're looking at submitting to BREC and using what 3 words together, that's a really useful tip. Thank you, Sue.
Great.
Let me just scroll down, see what else has come in. Someone shared that the local natural history societies can support community groups.
Mhm.
Several people saying about Festival of Nature, they do have really good events. And what was it? The Great Big Green Week, which also coincided, I think, last year with the Festival of Nature timings. They had loads of webinars and resources, so I imagine would have similar things.
Yeah,
Um,
and the Bristol Naturalist Society as well. They're really great for running events. If you go to their website, Bristol Naturalist Society, they run all sorts, a lot of bird stuff over the winter, but they really open up to be quite extensive for the rest of the year.
Yeah, and
Great. Well,
people have been sharing really great resources. So do have a quick look in the chat just before we wrap up if there's any links or anything you want to copy from there, because there's some really, really great information. So thank you so much for sharing that.
yeah,
And we will share, follow-up email as always, and the links to all the previous talks as well. But just wanted to say a huge thank you for being here with us either tonight if it's your first time, or for the whole 4 talk series and you've been with us the whole time. So thank you so much.
yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much, everyone. And yeah, hopefully to see your familiar faces around Bristol soon.